Hello, and welcome back to Religious Stories for Sleep. If you're new here, well, you've stumbled into quite the peculiar corner of YouTube. We specialize in the kind of historical content that's simultaneously fascinating and soporific, which, let's be honest, is exactly what you need at whatever ungodly hour you're listening to this. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey to medieval Europe, that charming era when everyone was absolutely convinced they were going to hell. And I do mean everyone. The peasant worried about stealing a turnip. The merchant worried about charging interest. The nobleman worried about all those people he'd killed. Even the priests were worried, though, as we'll discover later, some of them had better reason than others. Now, I want you to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Pull up that blanket. Maybe silence your phone, because honestly, if you're getting notifications at this hour, you need to have a serious conversation with whoever's messaging you about appropriate boundaries. We're going to spend the next 2 hours exploring what it was truly like to live in an age when sin wasn't just a concept. It was a constant, suffocating presence. Every thought, every word, every action carried the weight of eternal consequence. Imagine living in a world where forgetting to cross yourself before eating could theoretically damn your soul, where illness was seen as divine punishment, where your neighbor's misfortune might be interpreted as proof of their secret wickedness. Sounds exhausting, doesn't it? That's because it was. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets deliciously ironic. While ordinary people were terrified of accidentally thinking impure thoughts about the baker's daughter, the church elite were living in palaces that would make modern celebrities jealous. While peasants confessed to priests about taking an extra egg, those same priests were sometimes hoarding relics they knew perfectly well were fake. The whole system was a masterclass in do as I say, not as I do. Tonight, we'll walk through a typical day of medieval anxiety. We'll meet the preachers who specialized in terrifying their congregations into salvation. We'll investigate the bizarre world of holy relics, including 3 separate heads of John the Baptist, because apparently he was very generous with his remains. And we'll peek behind the curtain at how the people preaching poverty were dining on swan and building themselves architectural monuments. But we start as we must with you, or rather, a medieval version of you, waking up in a world where even your dreams might be sinful. Before we begin, if you enjoy this content, or if it successfully knocks you unconscious, which is really the highest compliment you can give us, please consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment telling us which historical period of existential dread you'd like us to explore next. And if you're feeling generous, leave a like. It won't save your soul, but it will help the algorithm, which is the modern equivalent, really. Now then, let's drift back to a time when guilt was an art form and eternal damnation was just one impure thought away. Imagine yourself waking in the darkness before dawn, not to an alarm, those won't exist for centuries, but to the sound of church bells. Always the bells. They mark every hour, every office, every significant moment of the day. They are the heartbeat of medieval life, a constant reminder that the church is watching, time is passing, and you are accountable for every moment. You lie on your straw mattress, and already, before you've even opened your eyes fully, there's a flutter of anxiety in your chest. Did you have impure dreams? You're not entirely sure, which is somehow worse. The priests have made it clear that sinful thoughts, even in sleep, can stain the soul. Some theologians debate whether you're culpable for dreams. After all, you can't control them, can you? But the uncertainty itself is spiritually corrosive. You make the sign of the cross. Then you make it again, because you're not certain you did it correctly the first time. This is the rhythm of your life now. Action, doubt, repetition, persistent low-grade fear. The room is cold. It's always cold unless it's summer, and even then, it's only marginally less cold. You share this space with your family. Privacy, as we understand it, doesn't really exist for you. Separate bedrooms are a luxury for the wealthy, and even they often share sleeping spaces. Your children are stirring in the corner. Your spouse is already up, moving about in the pre-dawn gloom. You dress quickly. There's a protocol, even for this. You've been taught that modesty is essential, even in the darkness, even when no one can see you. God sees everything after all. That's the central, inescapable fact of your existence. Every action has an invisible witness whose judgment matters more than anything else in the universe. Before you do anything else, before you eat, before you begin your work, you pray. On your knees, if your knees can bear it. If they can't, well, you pray anyway and offer up the pain as penance for your sins. Because you have sins. Everyone has sins. That's not self-deprecation. It's simply a fact of human existence as you understand it. Your morning prayers are a litany of requests for protection, guidance, and forgiveness. You pray to God, to Mary, to your patron saint, to the saints associated with your occupation, to the saints associated with your locality. Medieval Christianity is wonderfully crowded with intermediaries. It's rather like having to go through 17 different departments just to file a simple complaint. Except the complaint is, please don't damn me eternally. You don't pray in silence. That would be suspicious. Your prayers are audible, visible, performative, because your neighbors need to see you praying. Public piety is a form of social currency. The person who doesn't pray visibly enough becomes the subject of gossip, and gossip in a medieval village is not idle entertainment. It's a mechanism of social control with potentially fatal consequences. We'll return to this theme because it's central to how the fear of sin operates. It's not just about your relationship with God. It's about your relationship with everyone around you, all of whom are watching, judging, and reporting. Breakfast, such as it is, requires another ritual. You bless the food. You thank God for providing it, even though it's the same meager bread and pottage you eat every day, and you earned it through back-breaking labor. But to suggest that your labor alone provided your sustenance would be prideful. Pride, as you've been reminded countless times, is the deadliest of the deadly sins. It was Satan's sin. It was Adam and Eve's sin. It's the sin that births all other sins. So you're humble, or you perform humility, which in practice amounts to the same thing. Now, let's talk about what you're actually eating, because this matters. If it's a feast day, you might have some cheese, perhaps an egg if you're fortunate. If it's a fast day, and there are a lot of fast days somewhere between 150 and 200 per year, depending on how strictly your region observes them, you're eating vegetable, pottage, and bread. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. The fast days are a constant source of anxiety. Have you correctly identified which days require fasting? The rules are complex and sometimes contradictory. Different regions have different customs. Different religious orders have different requirements. You've heard stories of people who unknowingly broke a fast, ate meat on a Friday, consumed butter during Lent, and were struck down by divine punishment. Are the stories true? You have no idea, but you're not willing to risk it. Here's where it gets particularly interesting from a psychological perspective. The rules about sin are simultaneously very specific and impossibly vague. You know that murder is a sin. That's clear enough. But what about killing in war? What about executing a criminal? What about accidentally causing someone's death through negligence? The priests can explain the distinctions, usually at length, but the explanations often raise more questions than they answer. Sexual sins are even more complicated. And because you're human, you think about this a lot, despite trying desperately not to, which, of course, makes you think about it more, which makes you feel guilty, which makes you pray for forgiveness, which makes you think about why you need forgiveness, which means thinking about the sin again. It's a perfect spiral of shame. You've been taught that sexual intercourse, even within marriage, is only permissible for procreation. Any enjoyment of the act is suspect. Certain positions are sinful. Certain days are prohibited. Sundays, feast days, fast days, during menstruation, during pregnancy, during lactation. If you follow all the rules, there are maybe 60 to 70 days per year when marital intercourse is technically permitted. And even then, you're supposed to approach it with the grim determination of someone fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. This, predictably, creates an impossible situation. You have normal human desires. The Church insists these desires are the result of original sin corrupting your nature. You're supposed to resist them, but also fulfill your marital duty of procreation, but also not enjoy it, but also not refuse it, because that would be denying your spouse their rights. The internal contradiction is so profound that you simply exist in a state of constant low-grade guilt about your own body. Now you're heading out to work. The day stretches ahead. Hours of labor in the fields, or at your craft, or in service to your Lord. But before you leave your home, you dip your fingers in the small font of holy water by your door and cross yourself again. Protection against evil. Evil is everywhere, you understand. It's not metaphorical. It's not abstract. Demons walk the earth. Satan is constantly working to claim souls. The world is a battlefield between good and evil, and you are the contested territory. As you walk through your village, you're mentally reviewing your recent actions, trying to remember if you've committed any sins you need to confess. Did you feel envious when your neighbor's crops came in better than yours? That's a sin. Did you feel satisfaction when another neighbor's crops failed? Also a sin, probably worse. Did you work on Sunday? Did you work too little, showing sloth? Did you work too hard, suggesting you value earthly wealth over spiritual health? The Church has helpfully provided you with lists of sins to examine. There are the 7 deadly sins, of course: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. But beneath these are countless smaller transgressions. Did you speak unnecessarily? That could be idle talk, wasting time God gave you. Did you remain silent when you should have spoken? That could be cowardice or complicity in evil. Did you judge your neighbor? Christ said not to judge. Did you fail to judge your neighbor? But you're supposed to uphold Christian morality in your community. You cannot win. That's the subtle genius of the system. If we're being cynical about it, or the profound truth of human fallibility, if we're being charitable, you are always, in some way, falling short. Perfection is impossible. St. Augustine wrote about this extensively, the inherent impossibility of living without sin. But you're still supposed to try, and you're still culpable for your failures. The church bells ring for terce, the mid-morning office. You stop working briefly and pray. If you're close enough to the church, you might slip inside for a moment. The church is the physical center of your village, and not just geographically. It's the largest building, the most beautiful building, the most permanent structure in a world where almost everything else is temporary. Your house might burn down or collapse. The church endures. Inside, the air is different, cooler, thick with the smell of incense and stone and beeswax candles. The colored light filters through the windows, if your church has glass windows, which is unlikely unless you live somewhere relatively prosperous. More likely, the light comes through in plain shafts, illuminating the dust motes that dance in the air like tiny spirits. The paintings on the walls tell stories. This is important, because you can't read. Most people can't read. The images are your Bible, scenes of martyrdom, scenes of judgment, scenes of heaven and hell. The hell scenes are particularly vivid. The artists have put considerable effort into depicting the various torments awaiting sinners, demons with creative anatomies, fires that burn but don't consume, souls being torn apart, frozen, boiled, impaled. And the terrifying part is that these torments are eternal, not for a day, not for a year, not for 1,000 years, forever. Your mind can't really grasp forever, but the attempt is existentially devastating. You pray before an image of your patron saint. You've lit a candle, using precious resources to do so, because the candle is a visible symbol of your devotion and also a kind of transaction. I give you this light. You intercede for me with God. Medieval piety is remarkably transactional. Everything is an exchange. Good deeds for heavenly reward, sin for punishment, devotion for protection. Back to work. The morning stretches on. If you're a peasant farmer, you're in the fields, breaking your back in labor that is both tedious and exhausting. If you're a craftsperson, you're in your workshop, performing repetitive tasks that require skill but offer little variety. If you're a woman, you're managing a household, which in the medieval period means an endless succession of physically demanding tasks, hauling water, grinding grain, cooking over an open fire, spinning, weaving, caring for children, tending animals, and all of this while also working in the fields or at a trade. And through it all, you're monitoring your thoughts. The church teaches that sin begins in the heart, in the mind. Jesus said that looking at a woman with lust is equivalent to adultery, which means that thought crimes are real crimes. Your internal life is not private. God knows every thought, and you will be judged for them. This is exhausting in a way that's hard to articulate. Imagine if everything you thought was being recorded and would be played back to you at the moment of your death. Imagine if every fleeting feeling of anger, every moment of resentment, every flash of desire was evidence of your moral failure. You can't turn your mind off. You can't stop thinking. And because you're trying so hard not to think sinful thoughts, you think them more. The priest's warning about lust makes you think about lust. The sermon about envy makes you conscious of your envy. Medieval Christianity has, perhaps accidentally, discovered a psychological truth that wouldn't be formally articulated until the 20th century. Suppression doesn't work. Trying not to think about something makes you think about it more. But you don't have the vocabulary or the framework to understand this, so you simply experience it as your own moral weakness. By midday, you're exhausted, hungry, and almost certainly in pain. Medieval life is physically punishing. If you're over 30, You probably have chronic pain in your joints, your back, your teeth. Medical care, such as it exists, is a combination of folk remedies, prayer, and occasional intervention by a barber surgeon who might help you or might accidentally kill you. Disease is understood as divine punishment or demonic attack. The idea that illness has natural causes exists in medical theory, inherited from ancient texts, but in practice, your first response to sickness is spiritual. What have I done to deserve this? What sin has brought this suffering upon me? This is important, so let me emphasize it. Suffering is never meaningless in the medieval worldview. It's either punishment for sin, a test of faith, or an opportunity for spiritual growth through mortification. This means that when you're in pain, you're not just in pain. You're also anxiously trying to decode what your pain means. Is God angry with me? Is this a warning? Should I confess? Should I pray more? Should I make a pilgrimage? The church bells ring for sext, the midday office, time for another prayer, another examination of conscience, another moment of anxiety about the state of your soul. You eat your midday meal. Bread, pottage, perhaps some ale. The ale is safer than water, which you understand on some level, even if you don't understand why. You say grace. You're careful not to eat too quickly, which might be gluttony, or too slowly, which might be vanity. You're not trying to be ridiculous. You're genuinely trying to navigate a moral framework that has rules for everything and forgiveness for nothing. Well, that's not quite true. There is forgiveness. That's what confession is for. But we'll get to that particular ordeal shortly. The afternoon continues, much like the morning. More work, more pain, more vigilance against sin. You interact with your neighbors, and every interaction is fraught with potential transgression. Did you gossip? Did you speak harshly? Did you fail to help someone in need? Did you help someone in a way that made you feel proud? Here's a particular cruelty of the system. Good deeds can become sins if you take any satisfaction in them. If you give to the poor and feel virtuous about it, that's pride. If you pray publicly and feel pleased that others see you praying, that's vainglory. The Gospels themselves warn about this. Jesus criticizes the Pharisees for their public displays of piety. But you have to pray publicly, because secret prayer is suspicious. And also, you need to be seen being pious, because your reputation for holiness is important for your social standing. So you pray publicly, but try not to feel good about it, which is psychologically contortionist. Someone in the village is sick. You hear about it through the rapid, informal network of gossip that connects every household. There's a discussion about whether this illness is a punishment. What has the sick person done? There are whispers, speculation. Perhaps they were seen speaking with that woman who knows herbs. Is she a healer or a witch? The line is often unclear. Perhaps they failed to pay their tithes promptly. Perhaps they've been harboring secret sins. This is how terror operates in a community, through collective surveillance and shared anxiety. Everyone is watching everyone else, partly out of genuine concern for their neighbors' souls, partly out of fear that proximity to sinners might bring down collective punishment. God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness. Entire cities can be punished for the sins of their inhabitants, so your neighbor's sin is your problem too. The afternoon wears on. You're tired. You're always tired. Chronic exhaustion is the background state of medieval existence for anyone who isn't wealthy, but you can't simply rest. That would be sloth. You push through, offering up your exhaustion as a form of penance. Everything can be transformed into penance if you frame it correctly. Suffering becomes spiritually productive. This is simultaneously a coping mechanism and a trap. The church bells ring for none. The mid-afternoon office. You pray. Your prayers are becoming somewhat mechanical at this point. You've said the Paternoster so many times today that the words have lost their meaning. But you keep saying it, because the act itself matters, even if your heart isn't fully in it. Though, wait. Is praying mechanically itself a sin? Is it better not to pray at all than to pray without full attention? You're not sure. You ask the priest on Sunday, and he gives you an answer that is simultaneously reassuring and confusing. As the day begins to wind down, you start to think about confession. It's been a week since you last confessed. The church requires confession at least annually before Easter, but you've been taught that frequent confession is better. Some people confess weekly, some confess daily. The logic is clear. The sooner you confess and receive absolution, the less time you spend in a state of mortal sin. And if you die in a state of mortal sin, if you're killed in an accident or struck down by sudden illness, you go to hell, not to purgatory, to hell, forever. This is why sudden death is so terrifying. Not death itself, everyone expects to die, but the possibility of dying unshriven, without final confession and last rites. The stories about this are legion and horrifying. The man who postponed confession and was killed by a falling tree. The woman who died in childbirth before the priest could arrive. Their souls are lost. The stories are told as warnings, and they work. So you're already mentally preparing your confession. What sins have you committed this week? You run through the list. Anger at your spouse. Yes, that happened. Envy of your neighbor's new ox, definitely. Lying about, no, wait. Did you actually lie, or did you just not volunteer information? Is there a difference? There's probably a theological distinction, but you don't know what it is. The church bells ring for vespers, evening prayer. The day is ending. You're heading home. The sky is darkening. And here, in the twilight, fears deepen. Night is when demons are most active. Night is when the dead walk. Night is when sin feels more tempting and also more dangerous. You enter your home. Another sign of the cross at the door. You light the fire if you have fuel. You prepare the evening meal. You gather your family and pray together. The prayers are a shield against the darkness, both literal and spiritual. Dinner is much like breakfast, simple, meager, blessed. You eat. You're still hungry afterward, but you're always at least a little hungry unless it's a major feast day. That's just life. You don't complain about it, because complaint might be ingratitude, and ingratitude is certainly a sin. The evening is short. You can't afford to burn candles or lamp oil for long, so after a brief time, perhaps mending clothes, perhaps talking quietly with your family, you prepare for sleep. More prayers. A final examination of conscience. A final moment of anxiety about all the ways you've failed today to live up to the impossible standard of Christian perfection. You lie down on your mattress. The darkness is complete. And in that darkness, your mind continues its work, reviewing, worrying, fearing. Tomorrow you'll go to confession. Tomorrow you'll kneel before the priest and recite your sins and hope that you've remembered them all. Hope that your penance isn't too severe. Hope that your contrition is genuine enough. Hope that God will forgive you one more time. But tonight, in the darkness, you're alone with your conscience, and your terror, and your exhaustion. This is daily life in medieval Christianity, not constantly dramatic. How could it be? Drama requires energy, and you're too tired for drama. But constantly heavy, constantly anxious, constantly aware of your own inadequacy and the vast cosmic stakes of every tiny action. Now, imagine living this way for your entire life. Imagine never knowing rest from moral anxiety. Imagine never feeling secure in your salvation. Imagine the best possible outcome being centuries in purgatory, being purged of your sins through suffering before you're finally pure enough to enter heaven. This is why you wouldn't last a day. Not because the physical hardships would break you, though they might, but because the psychological weight of living in constant fear of eternal damnation would crush you. Modern people, even religious ones, simply don't experience faith this way. We've lost the capacity for that level of terror. And honestly, that might be one of the few ways in which the modern world is unambiguously better. But the medieval person doesn't know they live in terror. This is just life. This is how things are. This is how they've always been and how they'll always be. Until death, when the real judgment begins. A soft, transitional tone. But who created this system of fear? Who taught people to live this way? Who stood in the pulpit week after week, describing the torments of hell with such vivid detail that parishioners left trembling? That's where we turn next, to the preachers themselves. The traveling friars and parish priests who shaped medieval spirituality through their words. Some were genuinely holy men, wrestling with their own faith and trying to guide others. Others were cynical operators who understood exactly how to manipulate fear for their own benefit. Let's meet them. His name was Brother William, though that hardly distinguishes him. Half the men in religious orders seem to be named William or John or Thomas. He was born in a village whose name doesn't matter, to parents who are lost to history. What matters is that at 14 he felt a calling, or perhaps he simply understood that a life in the church offered more than a life behind a plow. The motivations of historical figures are always more complex than we'd like them to be. Brother William joined the Franciscans. This detail is significant. The Franciscan order, founded by Francis of Assisi in the early 13th century, was meant to be a reform movement, a return to apostolic poverty and genuine spirituality, in contrast to the increasingly wealthy and worldly church establishment. Francis himself had been the son of a wealthy merchant who gave away everything to live among lepers and preach to birds, and generally embody a kind of radical holy simplicity that was either divinely inspired or mildly unhinged, depending on your perspective. By the time William joined, 100 years after Francis's death, the order had already evolved considerably. There were factions within the Franciscans arguing about whether it was permissible to even handle money, or whether books could be owned by the order, or whether their churches should have any decoration at all. These debates were pursued with the kind of passionate intensity that only religious controversies can generate. People got excommunicated over these questions. Some were burned as heretics. The stakes, as always, were eternal. William received his training at a Franciscan house, learning to read Latin, studying scripture and theology, memorizing prayers and homilies. He was not, it must be said, a brilliant student. His Latin remained functional rather than elegant. His grasp of complex theological arguments was adequate, but not impressive. What William had, instead, was a voice, and an instinct for performance, because that's what preaching is performance. The medieval sermon was theater. It was entertainment. It was, quite often, the only entertainment available. And William understood this in his bones in a way that his more scholarly brothers did not. Let's follow him on a typical preaching circuit. It's spring. The roads are marginally passable after the winter mud. William sets out with a companion, because the rule requires Franciscans to travel in pairs. His companion is a younger friar, Brother Martin, who is quiet and scholarly, and will probably never be a successful preacher, because he lacks William's gift for reading a crowd. They walk. This is important to understand. They walk everywhere. The Franciscans are mendicants, begging friars. They own nothing, or they're supposed to own nothing. In practice, William has a warm cloak, decent shoes, a small leather satchel containing his breviary and some notes for sermons. He tells himself these are necessities, not possessions. The line between the two is something he tries not to think about too carefully. The roads are dangerous. Bandits are a real concern, though generally they leave friars alone. There's nothing to steal from men who've taken vows of poverty, and killing a friar is very bad for your soul. Still, William and Martin keep to the main roads when possible, and travel only during daylight. They reach a market town in the late afternoon. This is a prosperous place by medieval standards, perhaps 500 inhabitants, a weekly market, a substantial stone church and several religious institutions including a small Benedictine monastery and a house of Augustinian canons. The presence of multiple religious orders in one town is normal and also a source of tension. Everyone is competing for the same finite pool of donations, and the rivalry can get petty. There are records of monks and friars getting into actual fistfights over preaching privileges. William announces his presence to the parish priest, because protocol demands it. The priest is a man named Father Osbert, who is probably in his 50s, though he looks 70. Medieval aging is not kind. Father Osbert has held this living for 20 years. He performs the masses, hears confessions, baptizes infants, marries couples, buries the dead. He's not a bad man. He keeps a housekeeper who is probably his mistress, which is technically forbidden but widely tolerated. He occasionally skims a bit from the tithes, which is more problematic but also common. He preaches, when required, sermons that are perfunctory and poorly delivered because he simply doesn't have William's talent for it. Father Osbert is not pleased to see William. Traveling preachers are disruptive. They get people excited about religion in ways that create unrealistic expectations. Their sermons implicitly criticize the spiritual laxness of the regular clergy, and they take donations that might otherwise end up in the parish coffers. But Father Osbert can't refuse to let William preach. The Franciscans have papal approval, and denying them access would be spiritually dangerous and politically unwise. So, William is granted permission to preach in the churchyard after Sunday Mass. This is prime time, guaranteed maximum audience. Everyone will be there. William and Martin spend Saturday visiting the sick and the poor, which is partly genuine ministry and partly strategic networking. They learn the names of prominent families. They hear gossip about local conflicts and scandals. They discover who recently died, who is ill, who has suffered misfortune. All of this is material that William will weave into his sermon. Effective preaching is local. It speaks to specific anxieties and situations. Saturday evening, William prays and reviews his sermon notes. He's given this sermon before, dozens of times, but each delivery is adapted to the specific audience. The core structure remains the same. It's a sermon about the pains of hell and the necessity of confession and repentance. But the examples, the stories, The local references will be tailored to this town, these people. Sunday morning, the church bell rings, summoning the faithful, and they come. They always come, because attendance at Sunday Mass is mandatory. Absence is noted and will be questioned. The church fills with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and smoke. These are people who work with their hands, who live with animals, who bathe rarely, if at all. The church is cold despite the press of bodies. Father Osbert conducts the Mass in Latin, rushing through the familiar words. Most of the congregation doesn't understand Latin. The Mass is a mystery in the literal sense, a ritual performed in an incomprehensible language, offering glimpses of the divine through symbolic action. The elevation of the host is the climactic moment, when the bread becomes the actual body of Christ. People crane their necks to see it, because seeing the elevated host is spiritually powerful, protective against sudden death. The Mass concludes. Under normal circumstances, people would disperse. But today, there's a visiting preacher, and word has spread. People are curious. They file out into the churchyard, gathering in a rough semicircle. William positions himself on the church steps, elevated above his audience. Height matters. He needs to be seen and heard. He begins by making the sign of the cross. The crowd mimics him. Then he starts speaking, not in Latin, but in the vernacular. This is crucial. This is why traveling preachers are effective. They speak in a language their audience actually understands. William's voice is strong without being harsh. He projects without shouting. His first few sentences are conventional. Greetings, blessings, thanks to Father Osbert for his hospitality. And then he pivots. My friends, he says. And already his voice has dropped slightly, become more intimate. I want to talk to you today about fire. Simple opening. Effective. Everyone knows about fire. Fire is warmth and cooking and light, but also danger and pain and destruction. You know fire, William continues. You know what it feels like to burn your hand on a pot. You know the pain of it, yes? That sharp, immediate agony. Heads nod. He has them. Now imagine that pain. Hold it in your mind. And imagine that instead of your hand, your entire body is burning, every inch of skin. And imagine that instead of pulling your hand away after a moment, you cannot escape. You're held in the fire. You burn and burn and burn. And imagine that instead of lasting a moment, it lasts an hour, a day, a year. He pauses. The silence is absolute. And then imagine it lasts forever. This is William's gift. He makes abstract theological concepts visceral. Hell isn't a vague threat. It's this specific imaginable torture. That is hell, my friends. That is the fate that awaits sinners. And I tell you truly, here his voice rises slightly, every one of us deserves it. Every one of us is a sinner. Every one of us has earned that fire. This is the foundation of medieval preaching, universal condemnation followed by the offer of salvation. You break them down before you build them back up. William continues for nearly an hour. He describes hell in elaborate detail, the devils with their pitchforks and hooks, the rivers of flame, the perpetual darkness that is somehow simultaneously burning fire, the wailing and gnashing of teeth. He quotes scripture, but loosely, mixing in popular traditions and folk beliefs. The distinction between canonical doctrine and colorful embellishment is not something his audience would recognize or care about. He tells stories. A man in a nearby village who delayed confession and was struck by lightning, clearly divine judgment. A woman who mocked a preacher and gave birth to a deformed child, punishment for her disrespect of holy office. These stories may or may not be true, probably not in any factual sense. But they're true in the way that sermon stories are true. They illustrate moral principles. He personalizes his message. You there, Thomas the baker. And yes, William has learned the names of prominent townspeople. When you charge high prices for bread, when you use false weights, when you profit from your neighbor's hunger, you are stealing, and thieves go to hell. Thomas the baker looks simultaneously terrified and resentful. The crowd murmurs, and you, Agnes, a woman in the crowd, startles when you gossip about your neighbors, when you spread tales that harm their reputations. You commit the sin of detraction. Your tongue is a weapon, and God will judge you for the wounds you inflict with it. This is effective for several reasons. First, it demonstrates that William knows the community. He's done his research. Second, it makes the sermon feel personal and immediate rather than abstract. Third, it creates a collective anxiety. If Thomas and Agnes are being called out, anyone might be next. Everyone examines their own conscience more carefully. But William is too skilled to end on pure condemnation. He shifts his tone, softens his voice, and yet, he says, there is hope. There is always hope, because Christ died for our sins. His mercy is infinite. His love is beyond our comprehension. Now he's describing heaven, not in as much detail as hell, because heaven is harder to make vivid, but with enough imagery to provide contrast, peace, light, the presence of God, the end of all suffering, reunion with loved ones who died in grace. This can be yours, William says. Salvation is available to all who truly repent. Confess your sins, do penance, amend your lives, turn away from wickedness. It's not too late. It's never too late, until death comes and your chance is gone forever. He's building to his climax now. His voice rises, his gestures become more emphatic. Today. Today is the day. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today. Go to Father Osbert, make your confession, receive absolution, begin your life anew as a true Christian. And then, voice dropping back to conversational intimacy, because, my friends, none of us knows when death will come. It might be today. It might be in an hour. And if death finds you in sin, unshriven, then all the suffering I've described awaits you, forever. He makes the sign of the cross, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen, the crowd echoes. Silence, and then people begin to stir. Some are crying. Several rush immediately toward Father Osbert, clamoring to make confession. Others look shaken, disturbed, anxious. A few look skeptical. There's always a portion of the audience that remains unmoved, though they wisely keep their skepticism to themselves. William steps down from the church steps. People approach him, some to ask for prayers, some to request that he pray for a sick relative, some to make donations. William accepts the donations with appropriate humility, assuring people that their coins will go to support the order's work among the poor. Much of this is true. Some of the money will indeed go to the order. Some will be used to feed William and Martin on their journey. And some, if we're being honest, will be spent on small comforts that technically violate the Franciscan rule of poverty, but which William justifies to himself as necessary for his health and therefore for his ministry. Father Osbert is now surrounded by parishioners desperate to confess. He'll be hearing confessions for hours. He looks exhausted already. There's a part of him that resents William for creating this surge of spiritual anxiety. But there's also a part that recognizes William has done something Osbert cannot do, made religion feel urgent and real and terrifying, in a way that motivates action. William and Martin are offered hospitality by a wealthy merchant, a man named Geoffrey, who owns several shops and some rural property. Geoffrey's house is, by local standards, luxurious. There's a private sleeping chamber, real beds with actual mattresses, and an evening meal that includes meat and wine. Geoffrey wants to talk. Wealthy men often do. They want to discuss theology, or unburden their conscience, or sometimes just bask in proximity to holiness. William is good at these conversations. He's sympathetic without being judgmental, knowledgeable without being pedantic. He suggests that Geoffrey might consider making a donation to build a new chapel in the church, or perhaps fund a chantry where masses will be said for his soul after death. Geoffrey is interested. His wife is very interested. They're getting older, thinking about mortality, worried about the state of their souls. By the time the evening ends, Geoffrey has promised a substantial donation. William assures him that this generosity will earn heavenly reward. Both men understand this as a transaction, though neither would phrase it quite so crudely. That night, William prays. His prayers are genuine. He does believe in God, in salvation, in his mission, but his prayer also contains a certain amount of self-congratulation. The sermon went well. The donations were generous. He's good at this work. And there's pride in that recognition, pride he's aware of and confesses but can't quite eliminate. This is the complexity of the medieval preacher. William is not a simple hypocrite. He believes what he preaches, or most of it. He genuinely thinks he's saving souls. But he's also skilled at manipulating emotion, at using fear as a tool, at extracting money from people who can barely afford it. He lives better than the people he preaches to about poverty. He enjoys the respect and admiration that comes with his position. He's not evil, but he's not quite as holy as he appears. The next morning, William and Martin move on to the next town. This is the rhythm of the itinerant preacher's life. Travel, preach, collect donations, move on. Never staying long enough for the shine to wear off, never present to deal with the long-term consequences of the terror he's instilled. But let's look at a different kind of preacher. Not all of them were skilled performers like Brother William. Some were scholars, intellectuals, men who approached preaching as a theological exercise rather than a theatrical performance. Brother Hugh was one of these. A Dominican rather than a Franciscan, the Dominicans being the other major mendicant order, founded around the same time but with a different emphasis. Where Franciscans stressed poverty, Dominicans stressed learning. They were the order of preachers, trained specifically for the task of teaching and defending the faith. Hugh had studied at the University of Paris. He knew not just scripture, but philosophy, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas. He could construct elaborate logical arguments about the nature of sin, the mechanics of salvation, the relationship between grace and free will. His sermons were intellectually rigorous and almost completely ineffective at the parish level. Because here's the thing, most people didn't want sophisticated theology. They wanted stories. They wanted vivid imagery. They wanted to be frightened and then comforted, and then sent away with clear, simple instructions on how to avoid damnation. Hugh would stand in the pulpit and explain the doctrine of transubstantiation, how the substance of bread and wine changes to body and blood, while the accidents, appearance, taste, and texture, remain the same, philosophically fascinating, spiritually important, and completely over the heads of his audience, who mostly just wanted to know if eating meat on Friday would send them to hell. Poor Hugh would watch his congregation's eyes glaze over. He'd see them fidgeting, whispering, clearly not engaged. And he'd feel frustrated and somewhat hurt. He was offering them deep truth, and they wanted cheap entertainment. This tension between scholarly preaching and popular preaching was real and ongoing. The church hierarchy generally favored the scholarly approach. Preaching should educate, should elevate understanding, should be theologically sound. But they also recognized that popular preachers like William were more effective at actually changing behavior, even if their theology was sometimes questionable. There were also more problematic preachers, men who used their position to settle personal scores, to promote regional or factional interests, to incite violence against supposed heretics or Jews or other designated enemies. Consider a preacher named John, and yes, another John, they're everywhere, who traveled through southern France in the 1320s preaching against the Jews. His message was straightforward and horrifying. The Jews had killed Christ, they desecrated the host, they poisoned wells, they murdered Christian children to use their blood in rituals. None of this was true. All of it was believed. John's sermons led directly to violence. Mobs attacked Jewish quarters in multiple towns. People were killed. Property was destroyed. And John moved on, satisfied that he'd defended Christian truth against its enemies. This is the dark side of medieval preaching, the way it could be weaponized, the way fear and hatred could be given religious sanction. The church sometimes tried to rein in these more extreme preachers, but with limited success. Popular enthusiasm, once roused, was hard to control. And then there were the frauds, the men who claimed to be friars but weren't, who wore religious habits and preached and collected donations, and then disappeared before anyone could check their credentials. These false friars were a genuine problem. Church authorities issued warnings about them. They were condemned in sermons, ironically enough, but they kept appearing, because the role of wandering holy man came with certain privileges: food, shelter, respect, and money. And some people were willing to fake holiness for those benefits. The line between genuine and fraudulent preacher could be thin. Was the friar who exaggerated stories to make them more effective a liar, or just a good communicator? Was the preacher who kept more of the donations than strictly necessary a thief, or just pragmatic about survival? These questions didn't have clear answers. Let's return to Brother William, whom we left traveling toward his next preaching stop. He's been doing this for 15 years now. He's in his early 40s, which makes him middle-aged by medieval standards. His health is declining. There's a persistent cough he can't shake. His joints ache in cold weather. His teeth are in bad shape. The itinerant life takes a physical toll. He's also getting tired of it. The constant travel, the repetition of the same sermons, the never quite adequate shelter, the sometimes frightening encounters with hostile audiences or dangerous roads. When he was younger, it felt like an adventure. Now it feels like a grind. William is thinking about settling down, perhaps requesting a position at a Franciscan house, maybe becoming a lecturer or a confessor. Something stationary, something with regular meals and a permanent bed. But he's also aware that he's good at preaching, maybe the best in his region. He has a gift, and gifts are responsibilities. The souls he saves through his preaching outweigh his personal comfort. At least, that's what he tells himself. They reach a small village, smaller than a town, perhaps 100 inhabitants. There's a church, but no resident priest. A neighboring priest visits weekly to say Mass. The villagers are poorer, more isolated, less educated even than typical medieval peasants. William preaches in the church, which is little more than a stone box with a thatched roof. The audience is perhaps 30 people. He gives a simpler version of his sermon. Fewer theological concepts, more direct imagery, very basic moral instruction. Afterward, an old woman approaches him. She's perhaps 60, which in this time and place makes her ancient. She's shaking, crying. "Father," she says. She calls him father even though Franciscans aren't priests, but she doesn't know the distinction. "I'm dying. I know I'm dying, and I'm afraid. I've sinned so much. Will God forgive me?" William looks at her. She's worn out from a lifetime of labor and suffering. Her sins, if she's typical, are probably minor. Small acts of anger or envy or despair, the unavoidable transgressions of human existence. God's mercy is infinite, he says, and he means it. Confess your sins. Be truly sorry. Trust in Christ's sacrifice. You will be saved. She weeps with relief. She kisses his hand. She presses a small coin into his palm, maybe her only coin, certainly, money she can't afford to give. William accepts it because refusing would insult her and invalidate her offering. This moment matters to William. This is why he does what he does, or part of. Why? Not the performance, not the admiration, not even the theological correctness of his teaching, but this, the concrete comfort given to one frightened old woman who needed to believe that her suffering had meaning and that mercy was possible. And yet even this moment is complicated, because William also feels a flutter of satisfaction at his own compassion. He's aware of his own goodness in this moment, which means he's being proud, which means even this act of kindness is tainted with sin. There's no escape from the cycle, not for the preacher any more than for his audience. The most successful preachers became famous. Their reputations spread across regions. People would travel to hear them. They'd preach to audiences of thousands in city squares or open fields. These were the rock stars of their age, as absurd as that comparison sounds. Bernardino of Siena was one of these, a Franciscan preacher in 15th century Italy, known for his powerful voice, allegedly audible from incredible distances, and his fiery denunciations of vanity, gambling, and various forms of wickedness. He'd preach for hours, sometimes days in sequence, and people would stand in the heat or cold to listen. Bernardino had a trademark prop, a tablet displaying the letters IHS, a monogram for Jesus, surrounded by a sunburst. He'd hold this up during particularly emotional moments of his sermons. People venerated the tablet. They made copies of it. It became a popular image throughout Italy. This kind of preaching created problems. It generated religious enthusiasm that could tip into fanaticism. After Bernardino's sermons, people would bring their dice, their playing cards, their fancy clothes, their wigs, their mirrors, all the vanities he'd condemned, and burn them in huge bonfires in the town square. These bonfires of the vanities were dramatic and cathartic, and economically destructive. Artisans who made mirrors or fine clothing or decorative objects would watch their market disappear in an afternoon. Later, a preacher named Savonarola would follow the same pattern in Florence, with even more extreme results. His preaching would help topple the Medici family from power and establish a short-lived theocratic republic. The bonfires of vanities in Florence included not just personal items, but books and artworks. Priceless manuscripts and paintings were destroyed because they depicted pagan subjects or nude figures. Savonarola's story ended badly. He was eventually arrested, tortured, hanged, and burned by the same church authorities who initially supported him. His crime was partly political, but also spiritual overreach. He'd claimed prophetic authority, predicted future events, and implied that his teachings superseded those of the Pope. The Church could tolerate popular preachers, even encourage them, but not when they became too independent or too powerful. This was the constant tension. The Church needed preachers to maintain spiritual fervor, to keep people invested in Christianity, to compete with heretical movements that offered alternative versions of faith. But they also feared preachers who stirred up too much enthusiasm, who created movements they couldn't control, who challenged institutional authority. Most preachers, like our brother William, navigated this tension by staying mainstream. They preached orthodox doctrine. They supported the hierarchy. They directed religious energy into approved channels: confession, penance, donations, pilgrimage. They were, in effect, middle managers in the vast spiritual corporation that was medieval Christianity. William is now 50. The persistent cough has worsened. He knows what this means. He's seen it often enough. Consumption, probably. The slow-wasting disease that kills gradually and unpleasantly. He's been granted a position at a Franciscan house in a substantial city. His preaching days are over. Now he hears confessions and provides spiritual direction, and occasionally lectures younger friars on the art of preaching. He thinks about his life. Has he done good? He believes so. How many souls has he saved through his words? Hundreds, certainly. Perhaps thousands. He's brought people to confession who might otherwise have died in sin. He's motivated charity and reform and sincere religious devotion. But he's also spread terror. He's made people afraid, deeply, existentially afraid. And some part of him wonders if that fear was always proportional, always justified, always spiritually productive rather than simply traumatizing. He doesn't dwell on these doubts. They're dangerous. They lead nowhere useful. He confesses them as temptations to despair or pride or something, he's not quite sure what. The confessor assures him that his service has been pleasing to God. William wants to believe this. In his final months, weakening steadily, William is visited by younger preachers who want advice. He tells them what he knows. Know your audience. Use vivid imagery. Inspire emotion before demanding action. Be confident in your message even when you're uncertain about its details. One young friar asks him, "Did you ever doubt what you preached?" William is silent for a long moment. Finally, he says, "Every day. But I preached anyway. Because even if my understanding was imperfect, God's truth remains true, and people need to be shown the consequences of sin, even if the showing is imperfect." The young friar doesn't look entirely satisfied with this answer. William doesn't blame him. It's not entirely satisfying. Brother William dies in the winter surrounded by his brothers in religion, having received last rites and made final confession. He dies in the faith he preached. His soul's fate is known only to God. His legacy is the hundreds of sermons preached, the thousands of people moved to confession, the countless individual moments of terror and comfort and fleeting spiritual transformation. Whether this legacy is ultimately good or bad, or some impossible mixture of both, is, perhaps, not something that can be judged from within the same belief system that generated it. What's clear is that men like William shaped medieval Christianity in profound ways. They were the interface between official theology and popular belief. They translated abstract doctrine into emotional experience. They maintained the system of fear and hope and guilt and grace that structured medieval spiritual life. They were necessary, these preachers. The system couldn't function without them. And that system, for all its cruelty, for all its psychological damage, for all its manipulation of fear, did provide something. It provided meaning. It provided structure. It provided the possibility of redemption in a world that was often brutal and unfair and incomprehensible. Whether that's enough to justify the cost is a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. Soft, transitional tone. But the preachers didn't maintain this system alone. They had tools. They had props. They had physical objects that embodied divine power and made the invisible visible, the spiritual tangible. They had relics. And the world of medieval relics is, if anything, even stranger than the world of medieval preaching. It's a world where bones performed miracles, where pieces of wood commanded armies, where the authenticity of holy objects mattered intensely, and yet somehow not at all. Let's enter that peculiar landscape now. There is, in the treasury of a cathedral in Amiens, a plate. It's an elaborate reliquary, decorated with gold and gems and exquisite metalwork, the kind of object that represents hundreds of hours of skilled labor and enormous expense. And contained within this magnificent container is, well, they'll tell you, it's the front portion of John the Baptist's skull. In Antioch, there's another piece of John the Baptist's skull, also the front portion. In Constantinople, there's yet another fragment of his skull. You can probably guess which portion. Now, you might think this presents a problem. John the Baptist, however holy, however significant, presumably had only one head, and while that head could theoretically be divided into fragments and distributed to multiple locations, having 3 separate front portions suggests something has gone rather wrong with the accounting. The medieval church was aware of this problem. They were not stupid, whatever stereotypes might suggest. Scholars and clerics occasionally noted the mathematical impossibilities of relic distribution. One medieval writer dryly observed that if all the pieces of the true cross were gathered together, you could build a ship. But here's the fascinating part. These contradictions didn't invalidate the relics. The faith of the believers made them authentic. The miracles they performed proved their power. The logic was circular but unbreakable. The relics were real because they worked, and they worked because people believed they were real. Welcome to the bizarre, complex, occasionally hilarious, and deeply human world of medieval relics. Let's start with the basics. A relic in medieval Christianity is a physical object associated with a saint or with Christ himself. First-class relics are pieces of the saint's body, bones, hair, teeth, blood. Second-class relics are objects the saint owned or used, clothing, books, tools. Third-class relics are objects that have touched first- or second-class relics, thus acquiring holiness through contact. This hierarchy existed because the medieval mind understood power as something that could be transmitted through physical touch. Holiness was almost material. It resided in bodies and objects, and could be transferred like an electrical charge. This isn't metaphorical. They genuinely believed that touching a saint's bone conveyed tangible, spiritual benefit. The theological justification for relic veneration came from several sources. The bodies of saints were temples of the Holy Spirit. They had performed miracles in life, so they retained power in death. Honoring their remains honored God who had worked through them. It all made perfect theological sense, provided you accepted the foundational premises. And the benefits of relics were considerable. They performed miracles, healing the sick, protecting cities from disaster, ensuring victory in battle, guaranteeing good harvests, preventing plague. They were the most valuable assets a church or monastery could possess. A major relic meant pilgrims, and pilgrims meant donations, and donations meant wealth and power and influence. This created obvious incentives for fraud. The trade in relics was one of the most profitable enterprises of the medieval period. There were professional relic dealers who traveled between the Holy Land and Europe, selling fragments of bone and cloth and wood to eager buyers. Some of these dealers were probably sincere. They genuinely believed they were handling holy objects. Others were straightforward con artists, selling chicken bones as martyrs' remains and laughing all the way to their next town. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 was essentially a massive relic-looting operation. When the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, a Christian city, mind you, they were supposed to be attacking Muslims. But money and relics proved more tempting than ideology. They engaged in an orgy of theft. Relics were torn from churches and shipped back to Western Europe by the cartload. The Venetians alone acquired enough holy remains to stock multiple churches. Relics that had been in Constantinople for centuries suddenly appeared in France, Italy, Germany. The Venetians were particularly enthusiastic relic thieves. The body of St. Mark, patron saint of Venice, had allegedly been stolen from Alexandria centuries earlier by Venetian merchants who hid it in a barrel of pork to discourage Muslim customs officials from inspecting the cargo too closely. This story was told with pride as a clever bit of holy smuggling. The fact that it involved deception and theft and using pork, forbidden in Islam, as a deceptive cover was not considered morally problematic. The ends justified the means when the ends involved acquiring powerful relics. Some relic theft was even more brazen. There are documented cases of monks from one monastery breaking into another monastery to steal their relics. The justification was always the same. The saint wanted to be in the new location. The theft was actually the saint's will being manifested. The saint had chosen to relocate himself through the agency of the thieves, who were therefore not thieves at all, but instruments of divine intention. This reasoning is so audacious it's almost admirable. But let's examine specific relics and the stories around them. We'll start with the crown of thorns, because its history is particularly well documented and particularly absurd. The crown of thorns, the actual crown of thorns placed on Christ's head during the crucifixion, was supposedly kept in Jerusalem for several centuries after the crucifixion. Then it was moved to Constantinople. By the 13th century, it was in the possession of Baldwin II, the Latin emperor of Constantinople, who was desperately in debt. Baldwin pawned the crown to Venetian merchants as collateral for a loan. When he couldn't repay the loan, the merchants prepared to sell it. King Louis IX of France, later St. Louis, heard about this and bought it from the merchants for an enormous sum. He then bought the entire collection of Constantinople's Passion relics, including pieces of the True Cross, the Holy Lance, the Holy Sponge, and various other items associated with Christ's crucifixion. Louis built the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris specifically to house these relics. The building itself cost less than the relics it contained. The Sainte-Chapelle is one of the most beautiful buildings in Europe. Soaring stained glass, delicate stonework, a jewel box of Gothic architecture. And it was essentially a very expensive display case. Now, was the crown of thorns authentic? Louis certainly believed it was. He walked barefoot through Paris when the relic first arrived, demonstrating his humility before this holy object. He venerated it with genuine devotion. Pilgrims came from across Europe to see it. Miracles were reported. But consider the provenance. It had been in Constantinople. Before that, Jerusalem, before that, before that, the trail gets murky. There's no unbroken chain of custody from the crucifixion to the 13th century. There are just stories, traditions, and the faith of believers. Moreover, thorns from the crown of thorns, individual thorns that had been removed from the main crown, appeared in churches across Europe. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Louis himself gave some away as diplomatic gifts. Either the original crown had an improbable number of thorns, or many of these individual thorns were not, strictly speaking, from the crown Louis possessed. But again, this didn't matter in the way you'd think it should matter. The thorns performed miracles. People venerated them. They were spiritually efficacious. Wasn't that proof enough? Let's talk about Mary Magdalene, because her story illustrates the intersection of relic veneration, local politics, and creative historiography. Mary Magdalene appears in the Gospels as a follower of Jesus, present at the crucifixion, and the first witness to the resurrection. The biblical account says nothing about her later life. Medieval tradition, however, had quite a lot to say. According to these traditions, Mary Magdalene, her brother Lazarus, and several other early Christians were placed in a boat by hostile Jews and set adrift in the Mediterranean with no oars or sail, basically sent off to die. Instead, they miraculously landed in Provence, in southern France. Mary Magdalene then spent the rest of her life in France, either preaching and converting the locals, or living as a hermit in a cave, depending on which version you prefer. There was a problem with this story. It's completely implausible. Why would first-century Palestinian Jews use a boat as an execution method? Why would the boat land specifically in France? Why is none of this mentioned in any early Christian sources? The answer to the last question is that the story was invented in the 11th century by monks at the Abbey of Vézelay in Burgundy. They needed a major relic to attract pilgrims, so they suddenly discovered that they had Mary Magdalene's bones. They produced documentation, almost certainly forged, proving that her relics had been brought from Provence to Vézelay for safekeeping during the Saracen invasions. The story worked brilliantly. Vézelay became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in France. Kings and popes visited. Donations poured in. The abbey became wealthy and influential. But then, in 1279, a church in Provence claimed to have found the real body of Mary Magdalene in a crypt. They had documentation, also probably forged, proving their relics were authentic, and Vézelay's were fake. Conveniently, the rediscovery occurred at a time when the church in Provence was trying to establish itself as a pilgrimage site. So now there were two complete sets of Mary Magdalene's remains. Both claimed to be authentic. Both performed miracles. Both attracted pilgrims. Neither would admit the other might be genuine. The church's response to this situation was magnificently bureaucratic. They didn't rule on which set of relics was authentic. They simply allowed both sites to operate. People could choose which Mary Magdalene they preferred to venerate. The market would decide. This pattern repeated across Europe. Multiple churches claimed to have the complete body of various saints, or major portions of them, in quantities that defied anatomy. St. Andrew's body parts were scattered across at least 4 countries. St. Stephen had at least 3 complete arms in different locations. The Virgin Mary's milk was preserved in so many churches that one skeptical observer suggested she must have suckled the entire human race. The mechanics of relic authentication are worth examining because they reveal the epistemological flexibility of medieval Christianity. In theory, A relic's authenticity was verified by documentation. You needed to prove chain of custody. This bone came from this church, which received it from this monastery, which obtained it from this pilgrim, who brought it from the Holy Land, where it was kept in this location since antiquity. Paperwork mattered. In practice, documentation could be manufactured. Medieval forgery was not particularly sophisticated by modern standards, but it didn't need to be. There were no forensic techniques, no carbon dating, no way to scientifically verify age or origin. A document that looked old and official was usually sufficient. More importantly, documentation could be superseded by performance. If a relic performed miracles, that was proof of its authenticity. God would not allow a false relic to heal the sick or work wonders. Therefore, miracles validated relics regardless of their documented provenance. This created a wonderful circular logic. The relic works miracles because it's authentic. We know it's authentic because it works miracles. Any documentation is just confirmatory evidence of what the miracles already prove. Skeptics occasionally pointed out the problems with this reasoning. Guibert of Nogent, a 12th century abbot, wrote a treatise on relics that was remarkably critical. He noted the mathematical impossibilities, the dubious provenance of many relics, the obvious financial incentives for fraud. He suggested that veneration should focus on faith rather than physical objects. Guibert's treatise was largely ignored, not because his arguments were bad, they were quite sound, but because they threatened an entire system. Relics were too important, too valuable, too central to medieval religious practice to be subjected to serious, critical scrutiny. Let's consider the psychological and social functions of relics, because they did serve genuine needs. First, relics made the invisible visible. Medieval Christianity was full of abstract theological concepts: grace, salvation, divine providence. These are hard to grasp, harder to visualize, but a bone in a gold reliquary that you can see, that you can touch, or at least get close to, that's tangible proof that holiness exists in the physical world. Second, relics created connections between the local and the universal. Your village church might be small and poor and insignificant, but if it possessed a relic, even a minor one, a third-class relic that had touched something that had touched a saint, then your village was connected to the cosmic drama of salvation. You weren't just residents of nowhere. You were custodians of holy power. Third, relics provided practical benefits in a world where practical benefits were scarce. If you were sick and couldn't afford a physician, and most people couldn't, then praying before a relic and hoping for miraculous healing was a reasonable strategy. Sometimes it even worked, through the placebo effect or through spontaneous remission or through sheer luck. And when it worked, that confirmed the relic's power. Fourth, relics were objects of beauty in a world that was often quite ugly. The reliquaries themselves were works of art: gold, silver, precious gems, expert craftsmanship. For a peasant whose daily life was mud and labor and gray skies, a shining reliquary was a glimpse of heaven. The beauty wasn't incidental. It was part of the religious experience. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, relics gave people agency. You could do something about your problems. You could make a pilgrimage. You could make an offering. You could pray before a relic and feel that you were actively participating in your own salvation. In a world where most things were outside your control, disease, weather, the whims of nobles, the decisions of kings, relics offered a sphere of potential influence. Pilgrimage was the primary way ordinary people interacted with relics. If your local church had only minor relics, you might travel to see major ones. This journey was itself spiritually beneficial, a form of penance, a demonstration of devotion, an opportunity to accumulate grace. The most popular pilgrimage sites had major relics and good infrastructure. Canterbury had the tomb of Thomas Becket, murdered by knights allegedly acting on King Henry II's frustrated complaints. Becket's shrine became one of the richest in Europe. The offerings were so valuable that the treasury could fund significant church construction and still have surplus. Santiago de Compostela had the supposed tomb of St. James the Apostle. The claim that James had preached in Spain and was buried there is historically dubious. There's no evidence he ever left the Holy Land during his lifetime. But the pilgrimage route to Santiago became one of the defining experiences of medieval Christianity. Pilgrims from across Europe walked for months to reach the shrine. Rome had Peter and Paul and countless martyrs. Jerusalem had the sites of Christ's life and death. These were the premium destinations, the pilgrimage equivalent of luxury vacations, requiring months or years and substantial resources. But there were also countless smaller pilgrimage sites, local saints, regional martyrs, specific relics known for particular kinds of healing. If you had eye problems, you'd visit one saint. If you had fertility issues, you'd visit another. If you needed help with a lawsuit, there was a patron for that. Medieval Christianity was wonderfully specific in its specializations. The journey itself was significant. You traveled on foot, usually, unless you were wealthy enough to ride. You carried a staff and wore distinctive clothing marking you as a pilgrim. You were entitled to hospitality from churches and monasteries along the way, though the quality varied enormously. You faced dangers, bandits, disease, bad weather, dishonest innkeepers, wild animals, and you accumulated badges. Each major pilgrimage site sold pewter badges that pilgrims could wear or attach to their clothing. These badges served multiple functions: proof you'd actually made the journey, protection against evil, and status symbols. A hat covered in pilgrimage badges announced, "I am devout. I am well-traveled. I have resources. I am connected to holy power." Some people made pilgrimage a lifestyle. Professional pilgrims would travel constantly from shrine to shrine, supporting themselves through charity and whatever work they could find. These individuals occupied an ambiguous social position, respected for their devotion, but also viewed with suspicion. Were they genuinely holy, or just vagabonds using religion as an excuse for wandering? Chaucer's Canterbury Tales captures this ambiguity beautifully. His pilgrims range from the genuinely devout to the obviously fraudulent. The pardoner openly admits he sells fake relics, pig his bones passed off as saints' remains, while preaching against the sin of avarice. The knight has been on crusade. The wife of Bath has been on pilgrimage repeatedly and treats it partly as religious duty, partly as tourism, and partly as an opportunity to meet potential husbands. This mixing of sacred and profane motives was typical. Very few pilgrims were purely spiritual in their intentions. Most had multiple reasons: penance for sins, hope for healing, curiosity, adventure, social obligation, business opportunities. The pilgrimage industry created an entire economy. Innkeepers, food sellers, badge manufacturers, guides, protection services, all depended on the steady flow of pilgrims seeking encounters with relics. Now, let's address the question that modern people inevitably ask. Did anyone actually believe in these relics? The answer is, it's complicated. At the popular level, belief was generally sincere. Peasants who walked for days to venerate a saint's finger bone genuinely believed it was what it claimed to be, and that it held power. The distinction between real and fake wasn't always meaningful to them. If the relic worked, if people were healed, if miracles occurred, then it was real in the sense that mattered. At the elite level, belief was more nuanced. Educated clerics understood the problems. They knew there were too many fragments of the true cross. They knew the provenance of many relics was questionable, but they also understood the social utility of relics, the theological justification for veneration, and the financial importance of pilgrimage. So you get this fascinating duality. A bishop might privately acknowledge that a particular relic is probably not authentic, while publicly promoting its veneration. This isn't simple hypocrisy, though it's not hypocrisy either. It's a recognition that literal authenticity is less important than functional authenticity. The relic serves a purpose. It brings people to faith. It generates resources that support the Church's mission. In that sense, it's real even if the bone inside the reliquary is actually from a pig. There were also degrees of belief. You might be certain that some relics were authentic. The crown of thorns owned by the King of France, for example, had sufficient prestige and documentation to be convincing, while being skeptical about others. You might believe in the general principle of relics, while acknowledging that specific examples were dubious. And belief could be strategic. If you were a monk at a monastery that owned a major relic, you believed in that relic absolutely. You defended its authenticity against all challenges. Your monastery's wealth, influence, and entire identity depended on pilgrims believing in that relic. Your belief wasn't separate from these material concerns. It was intertwined with them in ways that made it impossible to separate the spiritual from the economic. The creation of new relics continued throughout the medieval period. When a holy person died, a monk known for sanctity, a nun famous for visions, a hermit with a reputation for miracles, there would be immediate pressure to preserve their body as a relic. This process wasn't always orderly. There are accounts of crowds tearing at a holy person's corpse, trying to get fragments of clothing or pieces of body. At the funeral of St. Thomas Aquinas, attendees reportedly cut pieces from his body to keep as relics, and the monks guarding the corpse had to fight people off. The Church tried to regulate this through the process of canonization, official recognition of sainthood. Only the Pope could declare someone a saint, and only after a thorough investigation of their life and alleged miracles. In theory, this prevented unauthorized relic cults from developing around individuals who weren't actually holy. In practice, canonization lagged behind popular veneration. People would begin venerating someone immediately after death, developing local cults that the Church would eventually either legitimize through canonization or suppress as unauthorized. The politics of this process were complex. Local bishops might support a canonization because a new saint meant pilgrims and revenue. The Pope might resist because there were already too many saints, or because the candidate was politically problematic, or because the alleged miracles weren't sufficiently documented. Sometimes bodies refused to decay, which was taken as a sign of holiness. Incorruptibility, the failure of a corpse to rot normally, was considered miraculous evidence of sanctity. Never mind that certain burial conditions or embalming techniques could preserve bodies. If a body remained flexible and fresh-looking years after death, that was God, preventing corruption as a testimony to the person's virtue. Saint Clare of Assisi, Saint Catherine of Bologna, Saint Cecilia, all were claimed to be incorrupt. Pilgrims could view their bodies, still supposedly pristine, as evidence of their holiness. The fact that these bodies were often actually quite deteriorated, but preserved through various means, or that the incorrupt body was actually a wax effigy, didn't undermine faith. The miracle was in the belief, not necessarily in the physical facts. Contact relics, objects that had touched a saint or a primary relic, were particularly interesting because they theoretically allowed infinite multiplication of holy power. If a cloth touched a martyr's bone, that cloth became holy. If another cloth touched that cloth, it too became holy. In theory, you could create an unlimited number of third-class relics through successive contact. This actually happened. Oils from lamps burning at a saint's shrine would be collected and distributed. Cloths would be pressed against relics and then sent across Europe. Dust from a saint's tomb would be gathered and preserved. All of these became sacred objects. The practical advantage was obvious. You could generate numerous relics from a single source. The theological problem was also obvious. At what point does the holiness become so diluted as to be meaningless? If a cloth touched a cloth that touched a cloth that touched a bone, does it still carry spiritual power? Medieval theologians debated this, naturally, without reaching definitive conclusions. What's fascinating is that even obviously absurd relics could become devotional objects if people believed in them strongly enough. There's a church that claimed to have a feather from the wing of the Archangel Gabriel. Angels, being spiritual beings, don't have physical wings or feathers. This was understood even in the medieval period. And yet the feather was venerated, because angels sometimes appear with wings, and if an angel appeared with wings, those wings might temporarily be physical, and if they're physical, they might shed feathers, and therefore this feather could theoretically be authentic. The reasoning is tortured, but not entirely illogical given the premises. And it worked. People prayed before the feather. Miracles were attributed to it, and it became a legitimate object of veneration. The Reformation would eventually attack the entire system of relic veneration. Protestant reformers condemned it as idolatry, as superstition, as a mechanism by which the Catholic Church extracted money from credulous believers. They pointed out all the contradictions, all the frauds, all the mathematical impossibilities, and they were right, in a sense. The system was full of fraud. The contradictions were real. The financial exploitation was undeniable. But they also missed something. The relics, authentic or not, served genuine human needs. They provided comfort, hope, beauty, meaning, and connection. They gave people something to hold on to, literally and figuratively, in a world that was often terrifying and incomprehensible. When Protestant reformers destroyed relics, smashing reliquaries and burning bones and dismantling shrines, they were destroying more than just objects. They were destroying a whole framework of meaning, a way of experiencing the sacred, a mechanism through which ordinary people could feel connected to divine power. Whether this destruction was necessary religious reform or cultural vandalism depends on your perspective. Probably it was both. In England, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII led to the wholesale destruction of relics. Centuries of accumulated holy objects were destroyed in a matter of years. The shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury was dismantled, and 26 cartloads of treasure were taken to the king's treasury. The saints' bones were allegedly scattered, though rumors persisted that they were secretly preserved. Similar destruction occurred across Protestant Europe. Reliquaries were melted down for their precious metal. Bones were thrown away or burned. Ancient shrines were demolished. Pilgrimage routes, which had structured European geography for centuries, became obsolete almost overnight. In Catholic regions, relics continued to be venerated. The Counter-Reformation actually intensified relic devotion as a way of distinguishing Catholic practice from Protestant. New relics were discovered, conveniently, often in regions where Protestantism was making inroads, and the Catholic Church needed to reassert its presence. The catacombs under Rome yielded a bonanza of relics. Skeletons found in these underground burial chambers were identified as early Christian martyrs, often on minimal evidence, and distributed to churches throughout Catholic Europe. These catacomb saints were elaborately decorated, dressed in rich garments, and displayed in glass cases. They were Baroque, theatrical, and effective at maintaining Catholic devotion. Were they actually martyrs? Probably some of them were early Christians buried in the catacombs. Whether they died as martyrs is unknowable. Whether their bones specifically match the names assigned to them is highly doubtful. But again, the point was not historical accuracy. The point was maintaining the connection between visible, tangible objects and invisible spiritual realities. The modern reaction to medieval relics tends toward either dismissive skepticism or romanticized nostalgia. Skeptics see only fraud and superstition. Romantics see a lost world of faith and meaning. The reality, as usual, is more complex. Medieval people were not uniformly credulous. They had doubts. They recognized contradictions. They were aware of fraud. But they also lived in a world where the supernatural was real and present and tangible. Miracles happened. Saints intervened in daily life. The sacred inhabited physical objects. This worldview is foreign to most modern people. We've been trained to separate the material and spiritual, to see religion as a matter of personal belief rather than objective reality, to demand empirical evidence for extraordinary claims. Medieval people operated under different assumptions. The boundary between material and spiritual was porous. Faith wasn't opposed to reason. It was the foundation for reason. The question wasn't, can this be scientifically proven, but does this align with God's power and purposes? Within that framework, relics made perfect sense. Of course, holy people retained power after death. Death didn't end their relationship with God. Of course, physical objects could carry spiritual charge. God had created the physical world and called it good. Of course, miracles happened around relics. God was actively involved in the world, responding to prayer and faith. The fraud, the multiplication of relics, the obvious contradictions, these were problems, certainly. Medieval people recognized them as problems. But they weren't fundamental challenges to the system, because the system was based on faith and experience, rather than empirical verification. A relic that performed miracles was authentic in the way that mattered. A relic that brought people to devotion served God's purposes. A relic that generated resources for the church enabled ministry and charity. The literal, historical authenticity of the physical object was less important than its functional authenticity as a mediator of divine power. This is frustrating for modern historians who want clear answers. Was the crown of thorns authentic? We can't know for certain, but probably not in the sense of an unbroken chain of custody from the 1st century. Does that mean it was worthless? Not at all. It shaped the religious life of medieval France, inspired architectural masterpieces, and provided spiritual comfort to thousands of pilgrims. Both things can be true simultaneously. The relic can be historically dubious and spiritually significant. Medieval people understood this instinctively. We struggle with it because we want clarity, categories, definitive answers. One final story, because it captures something essential about medieval relics. There's an account from a 13th century chronicle about a blind man who came to a shrine seeking healing. He prayed before the saint's relics for days. Nothing happened. He became frustrated, then angry. Finally, he took the reliquary containing the saint's bones and shook it violently, shouting that if the saint wouldn't heal him, he was a useless saint and didn't deserve veneration. And then, according to the chronicle, the man's sight was restored. The story is probably apocryphal, but it reveals something true about the relationship between medieval people and their relics. The relationship was personal, direct, sometimes confrontational. You could be angry with a saint. You could make demands. You could engage in what was essentially a negotiation. I've come all this way, I've made offerings, I've prayed. Now you need to hold up your end of the arrangement. This transactional quality offends modern spiritual sensibilities. We prefer our religion more refined, more abstract, less explicitly mercenary. But medieval people were practical. They believed in divine power, but they also believed that power could be accessed, petitioned, even bargained with. The relics were the focal points for these interactions. They were the places where heaven touched earth, where the impossible became possible, where ordinary people could encounter the sacred directly without mediation by priests or theologians or church hierarchy. That's the real mystery of medieval relics. Not whether they were authentic, most weren't, in any strict historical sense, but why they worked, how they provided meaning and comfort and hope and healing, how they structured medieval spirituality, how they persisted despite obvious contradictions, how they survived skepticism and continued to inspire devotion. The answer, unsatisfying though it may be, is faith. Not blind faith, but faith intertwined with practice, with community, with experience, with hope. Medieval people believed because believing was functional. It made their lives more bearable. It gave them some measure of control. It connected them to something transcendent. And sometimes, when belief was strong enough, miracles actually did seem to happen. Whether those miracles were divine intervention, placebo effects, coincidence, or something else entirely, is perhaps less important than the fact that they mattered to the people who experienced them. The relics have mostly vanished now, destroyed, lost, forgotten, or locked away in museum cases as historical curiosities. The shrines are tourist attractions. The pilgrimage routes are hiking trails. The faith that animated the entire system has fragmented into countless variations, or evaporated entirely. But for centuries, these bones and fragments and dubious bits of cloth were among the most important objects in Europe. Kings fought over them. Monks died protecting them. Pilgrims walked thousands of miles to see them. Cities rose to prosperity on their power. And perhaps, in the darkness of a medieval church, in the flickering candlelight before a golden reliquary, in the desperate prayer of someone seeking healing or forgiveness or hope, perhaps in those moments, it didn't matter if the bone inside was actually from a saint, or from an anonymous corpse, or from a butcher shop. What mattered was the faith. What mattered was the reaching out. What mattered was the possibility, however slim, however absurd, that the sacred might reach back. Long pause, transitional tone. But while ordinary people were walking for weeks to pray before dubious bones, while preachers were terrifying congregations with visions of hell, while the entire religious system ran on fear and hope and the constant threat of damnation, the people at the top of this system were living very differently indeed. Let's talk about them now. Let's talk about the church elite, the bishops and cardinals and abbots who preached poverty while dining on swan, who called for humility while building palaces, who warned about the dangers of wealth while accumulating fortunes that would make modern CEOs envious. Let's talk about the comfortable lives of those who managed the system of fear. The Archbishop is having swan for dinner. This is worth noting because it's Friday, a fast day, technically, when the consumption of meat is forbidden. But swan, conveniently, is classified as fish. Not because swans actually are fish, obviously, but because they swim in water, and medieval dietary law operates on a kind of poetic logic, where animals that spend time in water can be counted as aquatic for purposes of religious fasting. This same logic allows for the consumption of beaver tail on fast days. It's flat and scaly, therefore fish-like, therefore permissible. Barnacle geese, which medieval natural history claimed grew from barnacles attached to driftwood, could be eaten on Fridays because they weren't born from eggs like proper birds, but emerged from the sea. The reasoning is creative, to say the least. But back to our Archbishop. His name is Richard, and he's dining in the great hall of his palace. And yes, palace is the correct word. It has more than 40 rooms, soaring vaulted ceilings, stained glass windows, elaborate stone carvings, and enough tapestries to bankrupt a minor kingdom. The hall where he eats could comfortably hold 100 people, though tonight he's dining with only a dozen guests. Other church officials, a few local nobles, a visiting abbot. The swan is presented on a silver platter, garnished with herbs and sauces that have been prepared by a kitchen staff of 15. There are also fish, actual fish this time, prepared 4 different ways. There's white bread made from refined flour, a luxury most of his diocese never tastes. There are imported spices from the East, pepper, cinnamon, ginger. There's wine from France, served in golden goblets. This is a fast day meal. This is the Archbishop embracing religious austerity. On feast days, the meals are even more elaborate. Archbishop Richard wears robes of fine wool and silk, dyed in colors that require expensive pigments. His bishop's ring contains a sapphire. His crosier, the ceremonial staff that symbolizes his role as shepherd of his flock, is gilded and jeweled. His entire outfit costs more than a peasant family will earn in 10 years. After dinner, he'll retire to his private chambers, where a fire keeps out the cold that his parishioners simply endure. He'll sleep in a bed with feather mattresses and fine linen sheets. In the morning, servants will bring him water for washing, help him dress, and serve him breakfast. This is the man who preached last Easter about the spiritual dangers of wealth. Welcome to the world of the medieval church elite, where hypocrisy isn't a bug in the system, it's a structural feature. Let's be clear about something at the outset. Not all church officials were corrupt or hypocritical. Some genuinely tried to live according to the ideals they preached. Some distributed their wealth to the poor. Some lived simply despite having access to luxury. These men existed, and they were often admired precisely because their conduct was unusual. But they were the exception. The typical bishop or abbot or cardinal was a political operator who saw church office primarily as a source of wealth, power, and status, and the system was designed to reward exactly this type of person. How did someone become a bishop? In theory, through a combination of holiness, learning, and the will of God manifested through proper ecclesiastical channels. In practice, through family connections, political maneuvering, and money. Most bishops came from noble families. This wasn't accidental. The education required for church office, literacy in Latin, theological training, understanding of canon law, was only available to those with resources. But more importantly, the church wanted bishops who could navigate the political world, who understood how power operated, who had connections to the nobility and the monarchy. So younger sons of noble families entered the church, not usually because of profound religious calling, but because primogeniture meant the eldest son inherited the title and estates, leaving younger sons to make their own way. The church offered one of the few acceptable careers for noblemen. You could become a bishop, accumulate wealth and power, live in luxury appropriate to your birth, and do it all with the blessing of society and the church. Some entered church service as children, literally. Oblation, the practice of donating children to monasteries, was common among the nobility. A 5-year-old might be handed over to an abbey, raised within the monastery, trained for religious life whether he wanted it or not. By the time he was old enough to have opinions, his entire identity was wrapped up in the church. And if he came from the right family, if he was reasonably intelligent, if he learned the political game, he might eventually become an abbot or bishop. The appointment process for senior church positions was thoroughly corrupt. When a bishopric became vacant, the cathedral chapter, the assembly of canons attached to the cathedral, was supposed to elect a new bishop. In reality, the king or emperor or pope or some combination of these would indicate their preferred candidate, and the chapter would dutifully elect that person. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was officially forbidden and universally practiced. Wealthy families would make gifts to secure positions for their sons. Kings would trade bishoprics for political support. Popes would reward loyalty with lucrative appointments. Everyone involved knew exactly what was happening, but it was all dressed up in the language of divine providence and appropriate qualifications. Once appointed, a bishop had access to substantial income. The diocese collected tithes, 10% of agricultural production from every household in the region. There were fees for performing sacraments. There were fines from church courts. There were rents from church lands. A wealthy diocese could generate enormous revenue. Where did this money go? Some of it genuinely went to charitable works, feeding the poor, maintaining hospitals, supporting pilgrims. Medieval bishops did often engage in charity, partly from genuine compassion, partly because it was expected, partly because conspicuous generosity enhanced their reputation and power. But substantial amounts went to supporting the bishop's lifestyle, the palace, the servants, the elaborate clothing, the expensive meals, the horses and carriages, the retinue of assistants and secretaries and advisers, the gifts and bribes necessary for political maneuvering, the conspicuous consumption that demonstrated status and power. Let's visit a specific example. Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal Archbishop of York in early 16th century England, is almost too perfect an exemplar of church elite excess. But his career illustrates patterns that existed throughout the medieval period. Wolsey was born to a moderately prosperous family. His father was a butcher and innkeeper, which means Wolsey rose to power through ability rather than birth, making his story somewhat exceptional. He was brilliant, educated at Oxford, entered the church and caught the attention of King Henry VII through his administrative competence. Under Henry VIII, Wolsey became the most powerful man in England after the king. He was Archbishop of York, Cardinal, Papal Legate, and Lord Chancellor. He never saw York during the first 15 years of his tenure as its Archbishop. He was too busy running the country from London. The diocese was simply an income source. Wolsey built Hampton Court Palace. Let that sink in. A churchman who had taken vows of poverty in a technical sense, though not in any order that rigorously enforced poverty, built one of the grandest palaces in England. It had more than 1,000 rooms. It had gardens, courtyards, tennis courts, kitchens capable of serving 1,000 people. It cost a fortune. Wolsey's household staff numbered around 500. He traveled with a retinue that included nobles, knights, gentlemen, clerks, and servants. When he appeared in public, he wore scarlet silk and sable fur. He carried a silver cross before him as a symbol of his authority. He lived like a king. Actually, he lived better than many kings. And throughout all this, he was still technically a clergyman. He was supposed to represent Christian humility, poverty, service to others. He preached, or rather had others preach on his behalf, about the spiritual dangers of worldly wealth and the importance of humble service to God. The contradiction was so blatant that even contemporaries noticed. One observer wrote that Wolsey was the proudest prelate that ever breathed. When Wolsey eventually fell from power, he failed to secure the annulment Henry VIII wanted and was charged with treason. One of the accusations was that he had placed his cardinal's hat on the same level as the king's crown in official documents. The pride implicit in his every action had finally become politically unacceptable. But here's the thing. Wolsey wasn't unusual. He was extreme, certainly. His wealth and power were exceptional, even by the standards of church elites. But the basic pattern of his life, accumulating church offices, treating them as sources of income and power rather than spiritual responsibility, living in luxury while preaching about virtue. This was normal. Let's talk about pluralism and absenteeism, because these were systematic problems that demonstrate how thoroughly the church had prioritized revenue over ministry. Pluralism was the practice of holding multiple church positions simultaneously. A single person might be the bishop of 3 different dioceses, the abbot of 2 monasteries, the rector of several parishes, and hold various other benefices, all at the same time. This was obviously problematic. How can you shepherd 3 dioceses when they're hundreds of miles apart? How can you lead a monastery you never visit? How can you serve as parish priest in 5 different parishes? The answer is, you don't. You appoint deputies, vicars, suffragan bishops, stewards, to actually do the work, while you collect the income from all these positions. The system allowed wealthy and well-connected churchmen to accumulate enormous revenues without performing any actual pastoral work. The appointments were often hereditary in practice, if not in theory. An abbot might be succeeded by his nephew, though officially abbots were celibate and therefore had no family. A bishop might secure a position for his son, again officially impossible, since bishops were celibate. But everyone understood the reality. These were the bishop's nephews, a term that fooled absolutely no one. Clerical celibacy was supposed to be universal. All priests, monks, bishops, and other clergy were supposed to be unmarried and sexually abstinent. This rule existed for several reasons: theological arguments about spiritual purity, practical concerns about church property being inherited by clergy children, and a desire to ensure clergy loyalty to the church rather than to family. In practice, celibacy was widely ignored, especially among the wealthy clergy. They kept mistresses, euphemistically called housekeepers. They had children, euphemistically called nephews and nieces. They supported these families from church revenues. The Pope himself, during certain periods, had children and openly acknowledged them. The lower clergy were sometimes married. Parish priests in rural areas often had wives, especially in regions where enforcement of celibacy was lax. But the upper clergy maintained a facade of celibacy while living in domestic arrangements that everyone recognized as marriage in all but name. This generated cynicism among the laity. People knew their bishop had a mistress and children. They knew the monastery abbot was living with a woman. They knew church officials preached sexual purity while openly violating it. And this knowledge undermined the church's moral authority in subtle but corrosive ways. The monasteries were supposed to be centers of spiritual devotion and ascetic practice. In reality, many had become comfortable corporate enterprises. The larger Benedictine monasteries were essentially small kingdoms. They owned vast estates, sometimes entire villages, with all the agricultural production and labor that entailed. They operated mills, fisheries, and other businesses. They invested in trade. They loaned money. They were major economic players. The monks themselves lived well. In strict monastic rules, monks were supposed to own nothing, eat simply, wear rough habits, and dedicate their lives to prayer and labor. In practice, many monasteries had slipped far from these ideals. Take a wealthy Benedictine abbey in the 14th century. The monks eat meat regularly, despite rules against it. They drink wine or ale with their meals. They have private rooms rather than sleeping in a common dormitory. They have servants to do menial labor, freeing them from the manual work that was supposed to be part of monastic discipline. They wear fine wool rather than rough fabric. They receive allowances of money for personal expenses. The abbot lives in a separate palace within the monastery complex. He dines separately, usually with guests, often serving elaborate meals that would be at home in a noble household. He travels extensively, supposedly on monastery business, but often for his own pleasure or political maneuvering. He has his own household staff, his own horses, his own apartments. This wasn't true of all monasteries. The Cistercians maintained stricter standards, at least initially. The Carthusians were rigorously ascetic throughout the medieval period. The new mendicant orders, Franciscans and Dominicans, were founded specifically to return to apostolic poverty. But even the reform movements tended to drift toward comfort over time. The early Franciscans genuinely lived in poverty, begging for their food, owning nothing. 2 generations later, they were building substantial churches and monasteries, debating whether the order could own books, splitting into factions over whether their buildings could be decorated. The pull toward institutional wealth and comfort was powerful. The tension between monastic ideals and monastic practice generated constant internal conflict. Reformers would periodically arise, demanding a return to strict observance. They'd establish new monasteries following the original rule. These reform monasteries would attract donations from the pious who wanted to support genuine religious devotion, and then, over decades or centuries, the reform monasteries would gradually drift toward the same comfortable patterns as their predecessors. The cycle repeated endlessly. Corruption, reform, gradual decline back into comfort, new calls for reform. The pattern suggests something about human nature and institutions, that any organization, no matter how high-minded its founding ideals, tends toward serving the interests of those who control it. Let's talk about the papal court, because if we're discussing church elite excess, we need to address the apex of the system. The Pope was not just a spiritual leader, he was a monarch, ruling the papal states in central Italy. He had an army. He engaged in warfare. He formed political alliances. He was a player in European power politics, navigating between the Holy Roman Emperor, the French king, and various Italian city-states. The papal court was correspondingly lavish. The Pope lived in palaces, first the Lateran, later the Vatican. He was attended by hundreds of officials, cardinals, bishops, clerks, secretaries, servants, guards. The cost of maintaining this establishment was enormous. Cardinals, the senior officials of the church who elected new popes, were wealthy and powerful in their own right. They often came from ruling families. They controlled extensive territories and revenues. They lived in palaces, maintained large households, and engaged in the same kind of conspicuous consumption as bishops and abbots. When a new pope was elected, the cardinals who supported him expected rewards, appointments, benefices, favors for their families and allies. Papal politics were thoroughly corrupt, driven by familial and factional interests as much as by any spiritual considerations. Some popes were genuinely holy men trying to lead the church faithfully. Gregory VII, who fought to end simony and enforce clerical celibacy, lived relatively simply and took his spiritual duties seriously. Innocent III, who called the Fourth Crusade and presided over the Fourth Lateran Council, was by most accounts a sincere reformer despite his political maneuvering. But others were simply Italian princes who happened to wear ecclesiastical robes. The Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, had multiple children, engaged in murderous political schemes, and lived in spectacular luxury. The Medici popes were primarily concerned with advancing their families' interests. These men saw the papacy as a political position, rather than a spiritual calling. The sale of indulgences, the practice that would eventually trigger the Protestant Reformation, was driven partly by theology but mostly by money. Indulgences were supposed to reduce the temporal punishment for sins, drawing on the treasury of merit accumulated by Christ and the saints. In practice, they were tickets to heaven, sold to fund papal projects. Pope Leo X sold indulgences to fund the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The money rolled in. The sales pitch was effective. Give money, save your soul, contribute to the glory of God's church. Never mind that Christ had supposedly said it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. The church had found ways to monetize salvation. This is what finally broke the system. Not the wealth, not the corruption, not the hypocrisy, all of which had existed for centuries, but the blatant commodification of grace. When a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel allegedly claimed, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs," he crystallized everything wrong with the late medieval church into one appalling slogan. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, posted in 1517, attacked indulgences, but really attacked the entire structure of church finance and authority. And they found an audience because people were tired of paying for bishops' palaces, tired of funding papal wars, tired of watching church officials live in luxury while preaching about poverty, tired of the gap between Christian ideals and Christian reality. But let's return to our Archbishop Richard, because his story isn't finished. Richard is genuinely trying, in his own way, to be a good bishop. He's not a villain. He's not deliberately hypocritical. He simply exists within a system that has normalized the contradiction between Christian teaching and Christian practice. He does perform his episcopal duties. He ordains priests. He confirms young people. He dedicates churches. He settles theological disputes. He oversees the clergy in his diocese, punishing those who stray too far from acceptable behavior. He's generous in his fashion. He hosts elaborate feasts where local nobles and clergy are entertained. He gives alms to the poor, especially on holy days. He funds the construction and maintenance of churches. He supports hospitals and schools. By the standards of his time and class, he's doing what a bishop should do. But there's no escaping the fundamental tension. He lives in a palace while most of his diocese lives in hovels. He eats swan while they eat pottage. He wears silk while they wear rough wool. He has servants to attend to his every need while they work until their bodies break. And when he preaches, or when preachers under his authority preach, the message is about humility, poverty, the spiritual dangers of wealth, the difficulty of the rich entering heaven. Does he see the contradiction? Of course he does. He's not stupid. He's received theological education. He's read the Gospels, with their uncomfortable emphasis on poverty and simplicity. But he's also internalized a set of justifications. His wealth is not personal. It belongs to the office, to the church. He's a steward, not an owner. His lifestyle reflects the dignity of his position, and that dignity reflects the glory of God. His palace, his fine clothing, his elaborate ceremonies, these honor God, not himself. The church must have authority and respect in the world, and that requires worldly power and visible magnificence. These justifications aren't entirely wrong from within the medieval worldview. The church did need political power to protect itself. Bishops did need to be able to negotiate with kings and nobles as equals, which required living like kings and nobles. The visible splendor of church buildings and ceremonies did inspire devotion and awe. But there's a line between necessary authority and excessive luxury, and the medieval church crossed that line so far and so often that the line itself became invisible. Let's examine a day in the life of our Archbishop, because the details reveal the disconnect between ideal and practice. He wakes in his comfortable bed, attended by servants. His chaplain arrives to say private mass in his chapel. Richard participates, but his mind is partly on the day's business, meetings with the cathedral chapter, a dispute over property rights, a letter from the king requesting support for a new tax. After Mass, he breaks his fast with bread, cheese, and ale. Then he dresses, assisted by servants, in the elaborate vestments appropriate to his rank. The process takes 30 minutes. These are not simple clothes. His morning is spent in administration. The diocese is a complex organization requiring constant oversight. There are appointments to make, properties to manage, disputes to settle, correspondence to handle. Richard works with his chancellor and other officials, making decisions, signing documents, giving orders. At midday, dinner. Even on an ordinary day, this is a substantial meal with multiple courses. The table conversation ranges across politics, theology, local gossip, international news. Richard is an educated man, well-informed, capable of sophisticated discussion. He's not a simple glutton gorging himself. He's a nobleman who happens to be a churchman, conducting the social rituals of his class. The afternoon brings more administrative work, possibly some pastoral duties. Perhaps he's hearing a case in his ecclesiastical court. Church courts had jurisdiction over marriage disputes, moral offenses, cases involving clergy. Perhaps he's meeting with the master of the local hospital or school, both of which the church supports. In the evening, more prayer. The daily offices, vespers, compline, which he observes with his household. Then supper, which is lighter than dinner but still substantial. Then perhaps some reading, theological texts, classical literature, correspondence. Richard is literate, learned, interested in ideas. He retires to his chambers. He prays privately, examining his conscience. Does he feel guilty about his lifestyle? Perhaps occasionally, in fleeting moments, but mostly it feels normal. This is how bishops live. This is how they've always lived, at least in his lifetime. The alternative would be, what? To give everything away and live as a mendicant. That's not his calling. That's not appropriate for someone in his position. He sleeps well. His conscience is manageable. The system makes sense from inside. But some church officials did struggle with the contradiction more acutely. There's a 14th century account of a bishop who, late in life, became increasingly troubled by the gap between his lifestyle and Christ's teaching. He began giving away his possessions. He ate more simply. He reduced his household staff. He visited the poor in his diocese, actually sitting in their homes and speaking with them about their lives. His fellow bishops thought he was having a mental breakdown. His own staff worried he was becoming a heretic. The king, who depended on the bishop as a political ally, was concerned about losing a reliable supporter. The bishop defended his actions. He was trying to live as Christ had lived, as the apostles had lived. He was trying to actually embody Christian values rather than just preach them. He died within a few years, worn out by fasting and self-denial. After his death, there was some push to canonize him as a saint. But the political will wasn't there. A bishop saint who rejected wealth and power was implicitly criticizing all the bishops who embraced wealth and power. Better to let him be remembered quietly as a good but eccentric man. This pattern repeated occasionally throughout the medieval period. Individuals would take the Christian message seriously, try to live it authentically, and find themselves isolated and sometimes persecuted by the very institution that supposedly upheld that message. Francis of Assisi was the most famous example. He gave away his wealth, embraced poverty, lived among the poor and sick. He attracted followers who wanted to live the same way, and the church absorbed his movement, institutionalized it, gradually transformed it into something manageable. Within a century, Franciscans were debating property law and building substantial churches and living comfortably in well-endowed monasteries. The radical poverty Francis preached had been domesticated, made safe, incorporated into the system it was supposed to challenge. This wasn't entirely cynical. Radical movements are hard to sustain. Total poverty is difficult and potentially dangerous. Institutions need resources to function. The Church's absorption of reform movements probably kept those movements from burning out or becoming heretical. But it also meant that genuine reform never quite happened. The system was too entrenched, too interconnected with secular power structures, too beneficial to too many powerful people. Bishops who lived like nobles weren't going to voluntarily become poor. Abbots who controlled vast estates weren't going to give them up. Cardinals who enjoyed political power weren't going to step back into humble service. The system reformed itself only when external pressure forced change, and even then, incompletely. It's worth asking, How did ordinary Christians reconcile their own poverty and suffering with the visible wealth of church leaders who preached about heavenly rewards? Mostly, they didn't think about it too much. The social hierarchy was understood as divinely ordained. God had established kings and nobles and bishops in positions of authority. Questioning that hierarchy was questioning God's order. Rebellion against earthly authorities was rebellion against God. Moreover, the church did provide genuine services. Bishops might live in palaces, but they also supported hospitals, schools, and charitable institutions. The monasteries might be wealthy, but they did feed the poor, shelter travelers, and care for the sick. The system was corrupt, but it also functioned, and there was always the promise of heaven. You might suffer now, but if you remained faithful, if you followed the church's teachings, if you confessed and repented and did your penance, then eternal reward awaited. The bishop might have a palace on earth, but you would have a mansion in heaven. His temporal luxury was nothing compared to eternal glory. This is why the preaching about hell and purgatory was so important. It maintained the system. It kept people invested in a religion whose earthly representatives lived in obvious contradiction to its teachings. As long as people believed in judgment and punishment and reward after death, the earthly inequalities remained tolerable. Some people did recognize the contradiction more clearly and responded with cynicism or heresy. The Waldensians, a medieval reform movement, preached apostolic poverty and criticized church wealth. They were condemned as heretics. The Lollards in England, followers of John Wycliffe, attacked ecclesiastical corruption and translated the Bible into English so people could judge church teachings for themselves. They were suppressed. The church could tolerate a lot of internal corruption, but it couldn't tolerate movements that threatened its authority. Bishops living like kings was fine. Popular movements questioning whether bishops should live like kings was heresy. Let's end with a scene. It's winter. Archbishop Richard is in his palace, sitting near a roaring fire. He's old now, in his 60s, which is quite old for medieval people. He's tired. His joints ache. His digestion is poor. Too many rich meals over too many years. A young priest has come to see him. The priest serves a poor rural parish, and he's troubled. His parishioners are suffering. Crop failures, high taxes, disease. They come to him asking why God allows such suffering. They see the cathedral, its wealth, its elaborate ceremonies. They ask why the church has gold chalices while they have no bread. The priest doesn't know what to tell them. He's come to his archbishop for guidance. Richard looks at the young priest for a long moment. He could give the standard answers. He could talk about the mysterious providence of God, the value of suffering, the promise of heaven. He could explain that church wealth serves God's glory. He could say many things he's said many times before. Instead, he's quiet. He's thinking about his own life, the comfortable decades, the political maneuvering, the elaborate meals, the silk robes, the gap between what he preached and how he lived. "I don't know," he says finally. "I don't know what to tell them." The young priest looks shocked. Bishops aren't supposed to say, "I don't know." Tell them. Richard pauses, thinking. Tell them that the church is full of sinners. Tell them that we all fall short. Tell them that God's grace is sufficient even for our failures. Tell them to keep faith, not in us, but in Christ. The priest nods slowly. It's not a satisfying answer. It doesn't resolve anything. But it's honest in a way that standard theological explanations are not. After the priest leaves, Richard sits alone by the fire. He's thinking about his upcoming death. He's made arrangements, generous bequests to the poor, masses to be said for his soul, his body to be buried in the cathedral. He's tried to be a good bishop within the constraints of his position and his era. Has he succeeded? He's genuinely not sure. The fire crackles. Outside, snow is falling on the city. In the cathedral, monks are singing Compline. In the slums, people are cold and hungry and hoping to survive until spring. The system continues. It will continue for centuries more, until finally external forces, political, theological, social, break it apart. But that's far in the future. For now, it endures, magnificent and terrible, inspiring and corrupt, a monument to human capacity for both transcendence and hypocrisy. Archbishop Richard prays. He prays for his diocese, for the poor, for the church, for himself. He prays that God will forgive the gap between ideal and reality, between preaching and practice, between what he was supposed to be and what he was. And then he goes to bed in his comfortable chamber and sleeps the sleep of a man who has made his peace with contradictions he cannot resolve. Which brings us, finally, to the end of our journey through medieval fear, faith, and hypocrisy. We've walked through days of constant religious anxiety. We've listened to preachers terrify congregations with visions of hell. We've examined dubious bones and discussed three-headed saints. We've dined with bishops in their palaces while peasants starved. It's been quite a tour, hasn't it? And through it all, there's been this constant tension between ideal and reality, between the message and the messenger, between what Christianity taught and what Christians did. That tension never resolved. It couldn't resolve, because it was built into the system itself. But here you are, in your comfortable bed, in a world where religion is optional, where hell is metaphorical if it exists at all, where you don't have to confess your sins to anyone unless you choose to, where church leaders are scrutinized and criticized rather than blindly obeyed. The medieval world of religious terror and magnificent corruption is gone. We've lost something in losing it, the certainty, the structure, the sense of cosmic meaning that pervaded every moment. But we've gained something, too, freedom from constant fear, space to doubt, the possibility of thinking for ourselves. Whether that's a fair trade, well, that's a question for another time. For now, you're here, safe and warm, drifting toward sleep, with no fear of hellfire and no need to confess to anyone. Lucky you. Rest well.